Good day, colleagues, as you join in from all corners of the world. My name is Bongiwe Tutu. I am the project coordinator of the Africa-China Reporting Project based at the Wit Center for Journalism within the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. I am joined by our esteemed speakers, Maureen Haight, the Assistant Director, Communications and Outreach of the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, Charles Owino, Manager of Publications at the African Economic Research Consortium, Diana Muchai, Collaborative Research Manager at the African Economic Research Consortium, as well as Lucas Engel, Data Analyst of the Global China Initiative at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. Thank you so much, speakers, for being here with us, and warm welcome to you all. We look forward to your contributions. So I greet you all and thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on China-Africa Trade, Finance and FDI report, which is a timely engagement on the road to the next FOCAC summit. It is a great honor to have you all, and we trust that this webinar will be highly beneficial, providing you with key knowledge and information on databases on China-Africa, as well as practical skills and insights of accessing, using and interpreting data sources. This webinar is especially crucial as we will be discussing the China-Africa Economic Bulletin, which was published in April this year by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, together with the African Economic Research Consortium. The report analyzes 22 years of China-Africa trade, finance, and FDI data from 2000 to 2022 and presents a valuable resource for journalists, researchers, and other professionals and stakeholders to be able to learn from the evaluated trends, the revealed gaps, and the identified pathways for China's support to Africa's energy access and transition amid the economic challenges and energy opportunities. Over the past 3 decades, China-Africa economic engagement has deepened across trade, development finance, and foreign direct investment. And this has brought about some economic benefits and overcoming infrastructure bottlenecks in Africa, but as well some environmental risks and required deliberation of the replicated trade patterns where Africa exchanges its primary resources for finished goods. This is a key discussion more so as China's historic economic relationship with Africa has positioned it as a contributor to African sustainable development. And this is a topic that will no doubt feature prominently at the upcoming Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, in September this year. And if China and Africa intend to tackle the current development objectives, such as energy access and transition, at the FOCAC, what forms of finance and which industries are promising targets for the future cooperation, and how is media and research dissemination of these issues? So we're very pleased to be holding this collaboration with colleagues at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center and the African Economic Research Consortium, exploring their in-depth public global China databases and answering these questions among many. The Global Development Policy Center manages and updates these databases in a bid to provide transparent information to aid research, education, policymaking, journalism, and accountability when it comes to China's overseas development finance and projects around the world. Publishing this data supports journalists in analyzing trends and events to understand China's overseas economic activities. And these data projects are resourceful in that they guide and assist professionals discover more about China's overseas lending in an interactive and engaging way. Last year, we held a webinar on interpreting data sources, tracking China's overseas lending, development finance, and global energy finance databases, which is available on our website as a resource for information and knowledge building. So it truly is a great privilege to be realizing this initiative once again in the partnership with the Global Development Policy Center as well as the African Economic Research Consortium. And this initiative falls in line with the core objectives of the WITS Africa-China Reporting Project, which, since its establishment in 2009, contributes towards improving the quality of reporting on African and Africa-China relations. The project does this with the provision of facilitation and capacity building opportunities to journalists, media professionals, and academia. Through reporting grants opportunities, skills training tools, informative resources, training workshops, and forums. And at the center of these elements, the Africa-China Reporting Project is driven by its aims to amplify Africa's perspectives, to enhance its development within and through engagements with global players. And this is to elevate African voices, to empower journalists and researchers in their reporting and publications to wider audiences. So this webinar lends just that, and we encourage attendees to use this discussion to build their current and upcoming research fieldwork and reporting. But mostly this is to bridge the knowledge gap which exists in Africa-China media and literature. And as most of the attendees indicated in their registrations, that they were unaware of the existence of this report and the such. So we are very pleased to be able to provide a platform to unpack these resources which equip and inform and build the capacity of knowledge takers, makers, and creators on Africa and China. Within this webinar, attendees are welcome to present their questions or comments within the Q&A and chat functions here on Zoom. You can also share live tweets and Facebook posts to our social media accounts. We are at WITS China Africa Reporting Project on Facebook and WITS China Africa on Twitter. And we're also very excited by the global reach and impact within the interest received from attendees to this webinar, with participants joining in from countries across the globe, including, but to mention a few, the UK, Brazil, Switzerland, Japan, Italy, the USA, Chile, Indonesia, Hong Kong, China, India, Germany, and Canada. And within the countries in Africa, including Kenya, Zambia, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Ghana, Cameroon, Burundi, Uganda, and South Africa. We've also noted that the professionals that are with us are ranging from various fields, including journalists of media companies, researchers, lecturers, PhD and postdoc scholars, as well as professionals in policymaking, in public and private establishments of economics, banking, agriculture, and trade sectors. Welcome and thank you all for joining us. In moderation and the running of the webinar, I will be handing over firstly to Maureen Haight, Assistant Director, Communications and Outreach at Boston University Global Development Policy Center, to speak briefly about how journalists and researchers can access the databases by the BU Policy Center. Thereafter, I will hand over to Charles Owino, Manager of Publications at the African Economic Research Consortium, who's going to be presenting about the AERC approaches to research, training, capacity building for evidence-based policymaking. Then we will receive the key presentations from our speakers, Diana Machai and Lucas Engel, who I will introduce leading to their presentations. So without further ado, Maureen, I will now hand over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bongiwe, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. We are really delighted to be here. I'll just say a few words about our center to start. So as mentioned, my name is Maureen Haight, Assistant Director of Communications and Outreach at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, or GDP Center for short. The GDP Center is a policy-oriented research center working to advance financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. At the center, we have 3 research initiatives. The first is the Human Capital Initiative, which works to advance research on the role of human capital in development to inform policy solutions to global challenges, including poverty, women's empowerment, and sustainable economic growth. Our second research initiative is the Global Economic Governance Initiative, which examines the extent to which the traditional Western-based Bretton Woods institutions of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization are in alignment with development and climate ambitions and the ability to deliver green and inclusive prosperity. A complement to this group is our Global China Initiative, which works to advance research on China's overseas economic activity and engagement with international institutions in order to enable financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability. And it is with our Global China Initiative that we are here today. So I'm delighted to be here with my colleague, Lucas Ingle from the Global China Initiative, as well as our colleagues from the WITS Africa-China Reporting Project and the African Economic Research Consortium to discuss the latest trends in China-Africa trade, foreign direct investment, and development finance. We would love to connect after this webinar and stay in touch. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, you can visit our website at bu.edu/GDP. From there, you can sign up to our newsletters and stay up to date on our latest research, events, and commentary. And additionally, for all of the reporters out there, our experts are always happy to connect with you. So please feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to direct your inquiry. I'll share my name and email address in the chat. Please feel free to reach out. We also maintain a press list for our work on China-Africa economic activity and engagement. So if you'd like to be added to that as well, please let me know. All right, and thank you so much. And I'll pass it to my colleague, Charles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen, for that introduction. I will share my screen so that I can make a small presentation on AERC's, how AERC brings rigor and evidence into policy making and in Africa. But before I do that, I will just give you a short story about AERC and what AERC does, and since what AERC has been doing since inception. AERC has been in existence for 36 years, and for those 36 years, we've done quite a lot in terms of research, capacity building, in terms of training researchers, and also publishing research outputs that policymakers can access to help them formulate policies across the region. This China-Africa project is a very instrumental one because it will provide journalists with data that they can interpret in terms of trends for ease of reporting, and also it will unpack. The journalists can help in unpacking some of the issues that are contained in the report for the general audience, because the general audience really most of the people who might have access to the report may not be economists, and therefore they may not understand some of the concepts quite easily. So I think this is a very important webinar. It will be very interactive when the report will be presented. I'm sure quite a number of questions will come up from journalists, and they should be able to, after this, report some of the developments between Africa and China that will have been presented in the report. As AERC, we've done quite a number of work with China on Africa. There are a lot of publications that we have. If you go to our website, you'll see quite a number of publications that have been done that relates China with Africa, and this is just building on what we've been doing. So in terms of just how AERC does its business, we have the research arm. So when AERC was muted 36 years ago, the idea was to have Africans run their research so that they can advise policymakers without influence from outside. And most of the policy making in Africa during that time were actually advised with the resource persons or people from outside on African activities. So AERC came in to fill the void, and in filling the void, AERC has been able to train quite a number of researchers. I'll show you the numbers later, and they have continued to do research with AERC, and we always publish all this material and share with the policymakers so that it can shape the development of policies in their specific countries, because we normally have research that are focused on different countries, thematic, and of course the collaborative research. So we have the research arm, but AERC, when it was established, they quickly realized that there is no capacity to actually do the research. So AERC extended to have the training program, which has now been giving supporting masters and PhD students to complete their degrees, and therefore come back and fill in the AERC pipeline, so that the research papers that the proposal that they'll send and then develop them into research papers can be continually shared with policymakers. So that is the research arm that gave birth to the training arm. But anything that AERC produces, because we have quite a number of material that we produce on a regular basis, has to be shared. And that's where now the dissemination aspect comes in, where the policy outreach in the communications department, we do policy outreach and dissemination. And that gives you the approach. AERC does research, AERC trains, but also AERC disseminates the research that comes from the pipeline that of papers that we are producing. Now, since the last 36 years, we have done quite a lot in terms of transformation. And what has changed in AERC in less than in the last 35 years is, one, we've broadened the thematic areas. Initially, we had fewer thematic areas, but now we have 5 thematic areas that we look at. The evaluations the regular evaluation that AERC has been doing, when we had 4 thematic areas, it was realized that an additional thematic area was necessary, and therefore now we have 5 thematic areas that of focus that you can focus your research on if you are doing a proposal to AERC for support, for a grant to support the carrying out of that research. AERC has also built a capacity in fragile and countries that are emerging from conflict. And we have quite a number of researchers that we have today who are doing work with AERC that emanate from these countries. Also, in terms of expanding the consortium, AERC has been in link with the governors of central banks across Africa, and we have what we call a governance forum, and they are actually represented in the AERC board. So that is one thing that I think is important, because Africans have to have a skin in the game. That's why we are extending as much as possible to stakeholders so that they can support AERC activities. And in terms of the training programs, other than the masters and masters in economics and PhD in economics, we also have masters in agriculture that is came actually later after these 2 programs were already in existence. And in this, we are doing very innovative stuff in terms of training, in terms of delivering lectures to, say, students who have collected in a joint facility where we resource experienced lecturers from across the globe to come and instruct them on specific selected areas. And this has been happening in joint facility for elective programs that we do on an annual basis. So we have the SFSC, which is a special facility, and then we also have the joint facility. The special facility is for CMA, which is the agricultural economics, but the joint facility is for masters in economics as well as PhD in economics. But after COVID, we have done a lot of innovations, and all these programs are now run on online platform as opposed to physical. In terms of achievement, AERC has achieved quite a lot in assessment, and as we speak, we have over 3,500 researchers who have been trained. Their capacities have been built through our model, where we take researchers through, expose researchers to their peers during a biannual research workshop, and then they are advised by resource persons, and their capacity is built. As they do this, their capacity is built so that when they finally produce a final report, their capacity will actually have been built. And this has happened to over 3,500 researchers. We also have more than 4,000 researchers who have participated in AERC activities from over 40 countries across Africa. All these have been supported through grants and to produce or to carry out research so that AERC can pick those research and process them and share with the policymakers, because the advice that we give the researchers is that they should have policy implications or policy recommendations in their papers so that policymakers can easily pick what they can use while they're formulating policies. We have alumni across many sectors, some as high-level ranking as policymakers. And of course, AERC has impacted many African countries in terms of development, the research that we do, and share with policymakers. They pick these research proposals and help them in formulating better policies. And of course, just bridging the gap between research and policy has been quite good. We have flagship programs, which I've already mentioned, products that AERC has, which I think I've already mentioned. I think biannual research workshop, which is a vehicle for research capacity building. And of course, we have two workshops that take place in a year, like in June and December. We also have a senior policy seminar where we invite policymakers from across Africa, very senior level, at the level of ministers, assistant ministers, permanent secretaries, governors of central banks, and directors in various ministries to come together to debate some of the topical research that AERC will be working on. This is basically just to show you where our footprints are and what exactly we do in terms of events. And of course, in the next 50 years, we know that AERC will have an even much greater impact in terms of evolving and changing the context and the debate around economic development in Africa, and of course also strengthening institutional relationships that we already have with some of our partners. We will enhance this, as well as expand to more diverse populations. Of course, we are now operating across sub-Saharan Africa, but of course, in the next coming years, it will cover the whole of Africa. And then just the brand awareness, we do a lot of publications and we respond to requests from our stakeholders and have a lot of our materials packaged in such a way that they are attractive to the eye. Therefore, each person who accesses them really appreciate the diversity. And then also just linking with the private sector, civil society, and other stakeholders to help in terms of disseminating and sharing with them some of our products. I would like to stop there and perhaps give the mic back to Maureen or Ongiwe.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Charles, for that informative presentation. It's great to see the impact of the African Economic Research Consortium. I'm sure after this webinar, you're going to be receiving a number of emails from attendees who want to be a part of all the opportunities that you have shared with us. So we're really pleased to see the work that you're doing in the training and capacity building for African researchers, and also within the platforms of a master's and PhD levels. So now I will hand over to our two speakers, Diana Mochai, as well as Lucas Engel, who are co-authors to the China-Africa Economic Bulletin report, which we are all here to discuss. And just briefly to their introductions, Diana Mochai is a collaborative research manager at the African Economic Research Consortium. Previously, she was senior lecturer of economics at Kenyatta University in Kenya, a member of the advisory committee of the Environment for Development Initiative in Kenya, and a senior researcher with various multinational organizations. Lucas Engel is data analyst at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center for the Chinese Loans to Africa database. His research interests include international political economy, Chinese development finance, and China's role in global supply chains for critical minerals. Their full bios are available within the contents of the report. So for the interest of time, I'm going to allow them the platform for this very informative report, which has been long awaited by attendees. We have a number of questions that have been presented already, but should participants be want to present any more questions or comments to our speakers, please feel free to share these on the chat function here on Zoom or under the Q&A function, so we can present these during the Q&A session before we close the webinar. So Lucas, Diana, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to your informative presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you our participants for attending this webinar. We are grateful, and I'll just start by just indicating the layout of our presentation with my colleague Lucas. Probably let's move to the next page. We are doing a presentation on China-Africa trade, finance, and foreign direct investment, 2000 to 2002. So the layout is as follows. We'll start with the introduction, the energy access and transition, then trade, lending, and stock debt, FDI, and then we go to conclusion. And since I think our paper is on the website, we might not get into much details, but we're going to explain now. As a way of introduction, I just want to indicate that how has China engaged Africa economically. It has ranged from extending overseas lending and development finance to supplying foreign direct investment and increasing trade flows, of course, throughout the various cycles of African countries' economic growth. Just to mention that historically, China has contributed in the development of African countries by providing credit primarily for transport and energy infrastructure, so that we can have a picture of where we are heading to. So basically, such infrastructure normally has come with some mixture of economic benefits and, of course, with also some flaws. One of the things that we need to note when we have had this particular investment from the Chinese, some specific risk associated with debt stress, and of course, increased carbon dioxide emissions. Note that they have financed the energy projects that have influenced the current set of challenges. Now, the African countries themselves are trying to align with the to align with the United Nations SDGs and also the African Union Agenda 2063. These are documents that emphasize the aspirations for energy access and transition. Now let's move to the next slide. So given these scenarios that they are emphasizing on the energy access and transition, our question would be, what potential sources of financing energy and transition materials exist? What are these potential sources? And leading to that would be, what future paths of can China pursue to support Africa's energy access and transition amidst polycrisis? Just to note that the African continent has faced a number of crises ranging from climate change. We had the COVID-19, we had the impact, the Russian-Ukraine war, we have the climate change, and of course, many more, including the drought. So in the midst of this crisis, how can China pursue their support to Africa's energy access and transition, not forgetting that also a number of countries in Africa are under debt stress. Let's move to the next one. So just to help us move to the next slide, paint a picture of how China can support Africa. I just want to take us through where we are in as far as our energy production is concerned. If we look at the energy generation in Africa, we are seeing that we are only, utilizing a very minimal amount of our green energy. Not that we have said that Africa is trying to align itself to the UN SDG and the African Union agenda that emphasizes on transition and use of clean energy, but here we are utilizing very minimal amount. Please note that this is despite the fact that Africa has a great potential in as far as green energy is concerned. If I get my figures right, we are having like over 39% of renewable energy, of course, when we look at the world. And we also have almost 60% of solar within Africa. And so these are things that we are not utilizing within the continent. Basically, as we look at our generation, we use fossil fuels, which are, accounting for 75% of total electricity generation. What this simply tells us is that we have untapped renewables. Let's move to the next. When we get to the consumption, we find that actually we have the fossils accounting for 90% of energy consumption, which tells us that the renewables are accounting for only 10%. Remember that we are talking about transition to modern energy. This is despite the fact that we are having low electrification rate, whereby only 15% of the African population had access to electricity. This is as at 2021. And of course, 31% had access to a clean source of energy. One of the things that has been, quoted as a source of this is sort of the affordability part of it. And so let's move to the next and see the scenario as we move next. Now, the dilemma we have here is we are required to have 25 billion per year to achieve universal access to modern energy in Africa. Remember, the question that I've asked is, what are the potential sources? And we are required to increase investment from 24% in 2022 to around 37% to accumulate the required resources for a just energy transition. Looking at the literature, I realized only 2% actually of the global investment is channeled to Africa. So basically, you can see where we are when it comes to the investment we are talking about. So the challenge we have there as the African continent is accessing necessary and consistent capital to realize energy access and transition objectives, which we have already seen as some of the things that are being emphasized by the UN SDGs and the African Union agenda, which the African continent is trying to align to. The next slide, please. Now, the China's historically has, sort of funded two-track of economic engagement for energy and transition materials, and we are going to see this shortly. In the first track, they are financing the power plants, basically the energy plants. And in the second track, where we are getting much of the exports, we find that the Africa is exporting raw materials to China. So basically we are being, sort of funded in the energy power plants, the transmission and distribution pipelines, solar and wind farms. But in return, what we are doing, the other track that the China's economic engagement for energy and transition comes in the trade, which supports the energy resource extraction in Africa. So they are supporting the extraction, but apparently whatever we are extracting is being exported as raw materials. We are going to see that shortly, how the movement is being done in this trade. The next slide, please. Now let's look at the China-Africa trade so that we can understand about those two tracks of engagement. From this map, we realize that the Africa's trading partners, of course, their number, but we have had European Union, the United States, these are the major trading partners, and China. Of course, we also trade within Africa, within the continent. So we tried to get the major trading partners, but we can see over time, these are 2 decades, the China is actually sort of becoming a major partner in as far as Africa trade is concerned. We started with a small portion in 2002, but you can see in 2022, sort of the trade has increased, and we have quite a number of spots that are red. Let's move to the next slide. Sorry about that. Now, when we look at the trade balance, we realize that we have had a deficit here. So what we are having here are the exports to Africa, the China exports to Africa, and we are going to see what kind of exports are there. Actually, they are sort of more than the Africa exports to China, which basically gives us a deficit there, or a negative trade balance there. Let's move to the next slide, please. Now, when we look at the exports and imports to China by sector, we realize that what we can note here is that most of the exports to China, you can see from that graph, we have the blue one denoting China-Africa exports, and the light blue one is denoting Africa-China exports. Rather, Africa to China, that the other one is China to Africa. We realize that there is sort of a notable exports from China to Africa, and this, what we are getting here, which is basically in blue, we are having oil and transitional material, raw commodities, where we are having from China to Africa. Next slide, please. So you find that when we come to the exports, which are going from Africa, let's go back a little bit, which are coming from Africa to China, let me call them exports from Africa to China, you find most of them are coming from extractive sector and manufacturing sector. While when we look at the exports now from China, let me call them imports from China to Africa, most of them are finished products. So that's something that we need to take note of, that the African continent is receiving finished products while we are exporting raw materials, yet at the same time, we are talking about unemployment rates being high. Move to the next slides, please. When we look at the countries that are basically involved here, we realize that we have quite a number of countries. We have Angola that exports crude oil, and we have Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo. These are the top 5. Of course, others do export, whereby Sudan exports also crude oil. Then we have Republic of Congo, Democratic, which is also exporting copper, and Congo exporting crude oil. Basically, these are raw materials. Remember, we said that some of the investment that is being done, it is being done under 2 tracks, and one of the tracks is under the extraction track, which is being funded. Now, the exports actually have accounted for 2% of Africa's GDP in 2022, and within 2000 to 2022, they accounted for 69% of total export value. And these sort of are the raw materials. Let's move to the next slide, please. Now, when we look at the imports on the flip side, we are looking, these are from China, or rather these are Africa exports to China by country. We are looking at the imports, if I call them imports, which are coming primarily to Africa. These are, I said, they are finished products and they are from manufacturing. So basically we are looking at telecommunications, equipment, other finished goods such as footwear, fabrics, and automobiles. These ones have accounted for 51% of all imports that are coming to Africa. And basically, this is greater than 2.5% value of the GDP in 2022. Most of the imports are coming to South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and Algeria, and Ghana. Basically, we are looking at the top 5 countries. So let us not say that other countries are not receiving the imports, are not exporting, but these are the top 5 countries that are exporting and that are importing from China. Let's move to the next slide, please. Just before that, now what this basically paints is where we are heading to. We can see that there's a potential of investment into Africa's energy sector, and there's a potential of trade between China and Africa, as we have seen that trend the way it is moving. But then we need to ask ourselves about what has been happening in the other part when we talk about lending and debt. And I would want to invite my colleague Lucas to take us through that other session. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Yes, I'm going to share with you some findings on lending and debt, as well as foreign direct investment in the next section. I'll begin with Chinese lending, and we can switch here, I think, to the next slide. I'll begin with Chinese lending in Africa. So between 2000 and 2022, Chinese lenders provided around 170 billion in loans to 49 African countries and various regional institutions. Just for comparative stake, that's about 65% of the amount committed by the World Bank over the same period. Of the 170 billion committed by Chinese lenders, around 135 billion was provided by China's 2 development finance institutions. That's the Export-Import Bank of China and the China Development Bank. Next slide, please. Next, I'll take you through the sectoral breakdown of China's Africa lending. Between 2000 and 2022, Chinese lenders mainly targeted Africa's energy sector, which you can see here. It received around 35% of all loans, and the transportation sector, which received around 30% of loans. Other sectors of interest include ICT, financial services, as well as industry/trade and services. Next slide, please. One of the noteworthy trends we see in China's lending in Africa, and its energy lending in particular, is the predominance of fossil fuels. This is a theme that came up in Diana's presentation. So between 2000 and 2022, China's DFIs provided approximately 26 billion in loans to oil and gas as well as coal projects in Africa. That's just about half of their total energy lending and 20% of their entire lending portfolio in Africa. It does appear that China is honoring its 2021 pledge not to provide loans for overseas coal projects. Some of you may be aware of this promise. But China has yet to deliver on its promise to increase support for renewable energy projects. In 2021 and 2022, there were no new loans for energy projects in Africa. Despite the overall dominance of fossil fuels, hydropower represents a sizable portion of Chinese DFI's lending portfolio in Africa that deserves mention. China Exim Bank and CDB contributed around 16 billion to hydropower projects between 2000 and 2022. That's around 31% of their overall energy lending in Africa. Solar and wind energy projects, however, the so-called modern renewables, received only around 975 million over the same period. So the question we ask ourselves is, why have lenders, especially DFIs, been so timid about funding so-called modern renewables like solar and wind? One possible reason applies to most, if not all, DFIs, and that's the relative novelty of these technologies, the short time span within which they become obsolete, and the lack of long-term data. The lack of long-term data on these types of renewable energy projects. So inherently conservative DFIs that are very concerned with their credit ratings are reluctant to commit when there's unknown variables to this degree. In addition, there's also a kind of dynamic that's specific to Chinese DFIs, and that would be the favoritism Chinese DFIs have shown towards SOEs. And this favoritism that was shown in the past may have inadvertently influenced their allocation of funding away from overseas projects involving the types of green technologies that are dominated by ostensibly private Chinese companies. So Chinese DFI support for other aspects of the energy transition in Africa have also been modest to date. Many African governments have identified transition materials related activities as an area of growth, and they've tapped their external partners for support on these types of projects. Nevertheless, from China, they've received few loans directly for transmission materials related projects. China's forays into these types of activities come mainly in the form of FDI, as will be shown in the next section of this presentation, where Chinese lenders do deploy loans for transition materials related projects. These loans don't go directly to African governments. They usually take the shape of, one, Chinese mining companies operating in Africa, two, Sino-African joint ventures, and thirdly, loans can also be used as elements of larger deals that allow China to access resource assets in exchange for infrastructure loans. An example of the latter type of deal would be the Sicomines agreement in the DRC, where Chinese mining companies, or rather Chinese companies in general, received a mining concession for a copper cobalt mine in exchange for a loan from China Exim Bank. So next I'll talk about debt, beginning with the recent upsurge in debt during the pandemic. From 2021 to 2022, the median public debt to GDP ratio increased by 30 percentage points, according to the IMF. And of course, the cost of servicing debt has also increased considerably in recent years, stemming from the rise in interest rates, especially in the global north, and also depreciating currencies. But it's important to point out here that African countries' debt to GDP ratios and external debt to GDP ratios in particular have been on the rise for some time. So external debt as a share of GDP in Africa went up by 13% between 2010 and 2021. With that, we'll move to the next slide. So in addition to the scale of debt, the makeup of Africa's creditors has also changed considerably. China's share in Africa's debt rose from 1% in 2000 to 13% in 2022. That's roughly equal to the World Bank's share. However, China is by no means the sole or even the main player in Africa's debt. That deserves emphasis, really. In 2022, bondholders captured 28% of Africa's external debt. That's the largest share of any creditor. Next slide. So, while China is not the cause of debt distress in Africa by any means, it does have a special relationship with some of Africa's most vulnerable borrowers. The three African countries that defaulted in the last 3 years, Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia, are all among China's top 10 borrowers. Other countries on that list, Kenya, Angola in particular, narrowly avoided default in recent years and are still on a rocky road to recovery, shall we say. All right, so next I'm going to turn to FDI, or foreign direct investment. We'll jump right in with the next slide. From 2000 to 2022, Chinese companies announced around 112 billion in greenfield FDI and completed 25 billion in mergers and acquisitions, or M&A, FDI deals in Africa. As you can see in this figure, greenfield investments have remained generally steady since the 2000s, with a few peaks here and there. And M&A deals picked up after the 2008 global financial crisis. We see a dip in investments during the pandemic and a slight uptick thereafter. So here we see a sectoral breakdown of both greenfield and M&A FDI. We see energy and non-energy mining dominating across both greenfield and M&A investments. Though a significant portion of greenfield FDI, around 30%, also went to industry/trade and services. So on this next slide, we're going to look more closely at energy FDI. Here we see a familiar trend that we've heard in the trade section before, and also in the lending section. Chinese OFDI to Africa between 2000 and 2022 was heavily focused on oil ventures and fossil fuels. In fact, the three largest investors in Africa during this period were the China National Petroleum Company, CNPC, the China Petrochemical Corporation, Sinopec, and the China National Offshore Oil Corporation, or CNOOC. Together, these three SOEs supplied around 45% of all M&A FDI to Africa. It should also be noted, however, that greenfield FDI between 2000 and 2022 had a higher concentration in renewables than Chinese lending during that same period. Around 8% of greenfield FDI, that's about 3.3 billion, went to solar and wind projects between 2000 and 2022. Now we're going to turn to FDI and its role in non-energy mining and processing, as well as Chinese FDI's role in transition materials related projects. Overall, the non-energy mining and processing sector received approximately 40 billion in Chinese investments between 2000 and 2022. That's around 30% of all Chinese investments in Africa during that period. The material most targeted was copper. Investments in copper ventures flowed primarily to the DRC, Zambia, and Uganda. Bauxite, the primary input for aluminum, places second on the list, and iron ranks third. Cobalt and lithium, crucial inputs for EV batteries, were also among the top minerals targeted by Chinese investors. And with that, we will move to the conclusion, the next slide. So with trends in China-Africa trade, lending, and investment in mind, I'd like to summarize our findings and conclusions. Our analysis of China-Africa economic tide shows two tracks of engagement, as mentioned previously by Diana. The first is this electrification track, which represents general support for electrification infrastructure, mainly via Chinese lending. That's really the vehicle that's driving the electrification track. The second track we identified is the extraction track. This track begins with especially investments in resource extraction and leads to the export of African resources to China. It should also be noted that these tracks are intertwined, not separate. China's support for electrification projects benefits extraction. We found, for example, going through the data, that around 1/4 of all China-financed hydropower projects in Africa were associated with various metals extraction projects, an important point. So in summary, past engagement with China helped African countries overcome infrastructure bottlenecks. We know about the financing gaps, yet this engagement replicated trade patterns that entail an exchange of African resources for finished goods. So if China and Africa intend to break with past patterns and maintain a sustainable relationship, there will really have to be a shift from lending to investment. The debt landscape in Africa is no longer conducive to lending. It hasn't been for a while. But Africa's green energy potential represents a promising foundation for such a relationship. And with those remarks, I would close my part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Lucas and Diana, very much for unpacking that very informative report. I'm sure everyone now has a much more clear understanding of what is presented in the report. So really appreciate those insights on the trade, the finance, the FDI data, as well as looking into questions around renewable energy and investments to that sector. Also the trade balance or trade deficit rather that was presented by Diana, and as well inherently explaining these two different tracks of electrification and exploration and extraction, which play an interlinked role within the engagements of China and Africa. And I think we have quite a lot of questions that have come in while you were presenting. And while I read those, I'm also going to refer to questions that were presented prior to the session, which are quite interlinked, and a note that you've mentioned and referred to some of these aspects that are presented, but perhaps you can answer directly to what is being posed. So I think this speaks to the trade balance deficit and the question around the extractive sector. So I will combine the two questions that have been presented. One is from Davidson Omondi in Kenya, and the second is from Ayob Esatu from Ethiopia. So David has presented quite a lengthy question, so I'm going to read it as quickly as I can, but not to take away the context and meaning to that. He said, having read the China-Africa Trade, Finance and FDI report, I have several observations and questions. The report highlights significant growth in trade and investment, but there are concerns about debt sustainability and how African countries are managing these financial commitments. Additionally, the impact on local employment and skills development requires further analysis, particularly regarding the integration and benefits to local labor. And environmental sustainability is crucial as increased investments necessitate measures to mitigate environmental impacts. Finally, projections for future trends and emerging sectors of cooperation would be valuable for understanding the evolving dynamics of China-Africa relations. And if I can combine that question with that of Ayob Esatu from Ethiopia, who's asking, why is trade balance between China and Africa negative, and how can Africa correct this unequal linkage? I know, Lucas, you touched on that towards the end of your presentation, but perhaps within the context of what the questions are relaying, which is the impact on local employment, the requirements for skills development within those communities, as well as how can Africa correct these unequal linkages. So I'll allow you, Lucas and Diana, to respond to those questions, please.
I would leave the more trade finance, the more trade questions to Diana. I did want to pick up on the human resources or skills development question. I find that quite interesting. Yes, this is a challenge. I think for African countries to move up the value chain, it's not enough to build factories. You need workers to staff those facilities, and the human resources, the skills are not there. So the DRC, for example, has an export ban on raw cobalt. Only a type of cobalt that has been refined to a certain degree can be exported. That's a good beginning, but for example, if the DRC were to rework that export ban in a way that says only cathode materials or really downstream type technologies made from cobalt can be exported, that of course is a dangerous proposition because the human resources are missing, the skills are missing. So skill development and human resources development is absolutely crucial to moving up the value chain and correcting some of these trade imbalances, especially when it comes to this exchange of raw resources for finished products. With that, I'll hand it to Diana for some more insights.
All right. Thank you very much. I think in addition to these questions, somebody was asking about the chart. I've tried to explain. I've sent you the link to the document. Kindly look at that so that at least you can get a brief idea. The document is available on the website. When it comes to, I'm not so sure whether I got, it was mouthful, the question, the whole of it. But one of the things probably I could say is the kind of investments that we are channeling this kind of loans to, that would be a little bit more questionable. Again, the kind of governance of the things that are within our continent, again, that one also would be questionable. Basically, if we get something to sort of invest, are we channeling this to a productive investment? I know with the kind of debt we have, we tend to pay more of the debt once we receive any loan or any finance, and even forget to do an investment. So the question would be, how do we strike a balance? Do we also try to get sort of concessional financing? Should we do a bit more of domestic resource mobilization? And how do we go about this so that at the end of the day, we strike a balance between the trade deficit that we are seeing here? Because if we are not able to invest in productive sort of engagements, then we end up still, getting into the cycle. We borrow to repay a loan. Once, by the time that is over, we borrow again and again. But we have this idea of the FCFTA, basically, which if the African continent would try to leverage on this, can unlock quite a number of opportunities for local and global businesses to enter and expand throughout the new markets across the continent. And this one can sort of increase some of the international exports and intra-African trade, because you find that we are more endowed when it comes to the green technology, minerals, and agriculture. We can leverage on each other's comparative advantage as much as we are trying to, to export outside our continental area. And this one sort of can try to move forth and unlock major opportunities and also enable the investment that are coming from the China. It is going to offer them sort of, I would say, the Chinese businesses access to a larger unified African market. It is not just going to get to specific markets where they are going to extract. So the African Continental Free Trade Area can accelerate the trend by promoting the growth of sort of the global value chains and try to open up the market so that when we get the Chinese businesses, basically they can look at a unified market and not just those segments which we have. I'm not so sure whether I caught, the other parts of the question.
Yes,
I'm not so sure.
I think you captured it quite well. Thank you so much, Diana. And I think what we can also appreciate from the report is the nuance that you were able to present, particularly within the presentation on the debt distress, and that looking at China-Africa trade and investment and loans, and aligning that to Africa's debt distress as a singular causation is a problematic, and that kind of nuance we have seen is commonly missing from reporting that is done on China and Africa, that we don't look at the context to assess exactly what it is that is frustrating countries in addition to Chinese loans and investments to countries in Africa. So truly appreciate that nuance that you're presenting for reporters and researchers to put in that kind of perspective as they are doing, continuing doing their research and fieldwork on China and Africa. And I think to that we have questions which are rather to look at other global players. These are questions that have come from doctoral candidates in South Africa and the USA. One is, how does it compare to the EU and USA contribution towards Africa? And the second is, how does it compare with the experience of China in Latin America? I understand that the presentation was solely to African countries, but I wonder if you can maybe respond to those questions, if there's been any further comparative study done for other global regions, which is the EU and USA, as well as Latin America. And I think that adds to that nuance of exactly what are the experiences that are taking place in Africa apart from China's involvement.
The comparative nature of China's investments and their loans in Africa, I do want to note that I'm not an expert on EU investment and loans in Africa or US investments. But of course, what we're seeing from the US and the EU is a kind of a crowding in approach. This is the new approach that's been chosen. Frankly, a lot of the funds that were previously allocated were simply repackaged, and the idea is de-risking private investment in Africa. I know that for the EU has recently released an internal paper that identified a number of deficits with their approach, too spread out, not focused. I think I'm somewhat skeptical when it comes to the concept of crowding in. I haven't seen it work very effectively. And of course, the US is doing a similar thing with its libido corridor in Angola, Zambia, and the DRC. I don't think, like I said, I think this is going to take a long time to materialize. If it does materialize, on the other hand, of course, China has a hard time with FDI and with investments. European and US investors are far more mature. They are used to these types of deals. They're used to going overseas. Chinese companies are fairly new to the game. I think that deserves some mention. So it's much easier to go abroad when you have a loan that's paying for an EPC contract, an engineering, procurement, and construction contract that's over in a number of years and paid for. When you're actually taking the risk to go into a country, that is a very difficult thing to do. So where Chinese investments go in the future, that's really going to depend on Chinese companies' risk-taking abilities and capacity.
Thank you. Diana, if you have anything to add, you can go. Otherwise, I can move to the next question. All right. So this is a question from Robert Habimana from Uganda. It's a two-part question. He writes, having listened to this report, firstly, Marcus, I think he means Lucas, do you think Africa will realize employment potentials given a huge chunk of raw materials are exported to China? Do you think our employment levels are sustainable? Our youth would be engaged in the process of converting raw materials into finished products, but we highly export them, so even the rising debts are not sustainable. Second part to that question is compare concessional financing by World Bank and IMF with loans from China. What do you think is a better opportunity for Africa between China and the World Bank? So if you can please respond to those, and we've got two hands that we can allow to speak. I don't know if you want to take questions as a lot, or if you want to respond to them as I've noted them. Should I take more, or you would like to respond to these ones I've mentioned?
I don't mind responding one by one. Maybe that's it'll help me keep track of especially multi-part questions.
Yes. Okay, so let's respond to that question from Uganda.
Sure, yes. Thank you for your question. I'll begin with the second part of your question, the comparison of Chinese finance and World Bank finance. Of course, in terms of concessionality, the World Bank is where you want to go, really. Chinese interest rates, if you compare them across the board, they're cheaper on average than commercial lenders, but of course they are not as concessional as the World Bank would be. So ideally you would go to the World Bank. But other studies have shown, for example, that it isn't an either-or approach. African countries will go to Chinese partners for certain projects, and they will go to the World Bank for other projects. Another thing I want to note is that actually a study recently published using some very interesting methodology from our center, author was Yan Wang, I don't quite remember the title, but that study shows that Chinese financed infrastructure projects have a significant, statistically significant impact on economic growth in African countries comparative to the World Bank, which in that case, in that study, were not shown to have an impact on growth. And this is one of several studies at this point that has shown this. So Chinese infrastructure projects are being shown to have an impact on growth, whereas World Bank financed infrastructure projects are not being found to have that type of impact. A very interesting finding that I would direct your attention to. As for the first part of the questions, how does Africa realize employment goals? I'm not entirely sure about that, and I can't give you the numbers on employment in Chinese financed finance projects versus other countries' finance projects. I will say that China has made considerable efforts to implement more worker protection. There were, at this point, quite a while ago, a lot of protests in Zambia, for example, in copper mines owned by Chinese companies. And Chinese companies in recent years have been pressured by the Chinese government to implement better employment conditions. Yeah, that's not just, okay, of course, that'll.
Sorry to cut you. No, I was just going to point out that Maureen shared a report in the chat, which I think answers that question on employment in Chinese projects. The report is titled Direct Impacts and Spatial Spillovers, the Impact of Chinese Infrastructure Projects on Economic Activities in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I just wanted to note that reading that report might be able to answer that question on employment. Diana, do you have anything to add to that, or shall we take the hand that is up?
I think that's quite in order, but I'd already talked about it, focusing on productive investments and looking at the governance structure. Basically, we can do something when it comes to the African continent. And somebody also had mentioned about whether there's another comparative. I know there's another study they can check from the Boston University for China and Latin America. There's also another bulletin that came before this one, so they can also get that online. Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. So the first hand is from Jerry. We have Jerry Harris and Abiodun Ebutokun. So I will start with the first hand that was up, which is Abiodun. We'll allow you to speak, to raise your question. If you can please be brief with your question to the speakers, please. Okay, then we'll refer to the third hand that is up. Tohib, you may direct your question to the speakers.
Okay, thank you so much. My question is about how do we actually make sure that we are able to move from these trade imbalances? Because for me, from my understanding, we actually have a lot of partnership with different countries. And for me, this is the value chain we are not getting, because even though we are getting foreign aid, we are having some treaty with some other countries for them to give us foreign direct investment in order to enhance our economic growth. Still yet our export is just a little section of the value chain. In fact, we are not even producing much of the finished goods. And I think that's actually causing the problem, because if you could be able to move the value chain value to the hub in which we are actually producing more technical goods, we could be able to make a lot of money from international trade. And moreover, there is no too strong political wills of the political leadership in Africa to actually enhance the infrastructures of this local industry for them to actually have more better goods and able to actually earn more in the international market. That's just my summation about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tohib. I'll hand over to Diane and Lucas to respond to that.
I should just say, I think he has put it well. I would say it was sort of a statement. I'd already mentioned that about the African Free Trade Continental Area. I'd attach that. And he has put it very well on how we can sort of try to move from this kind of trade imbalance. I'd also talked about us focusing on more or less productive investments. So basically, we sort of stop just, focusing on other investments that do not bring more revenues to the country in a way that we can be able even to sort of have more revenue, because I want to believe that as much as the track of extraction is being funded, there's a way that we can expose ourselves such that we do the production and not just exporting the raw materials. And that's why I was talking about us focusing on productive investment, and we also focus on the domestic resource mobilization. And we sort of try to look at concessional financing such that we are not just, getting loans for the sake of getting loans because we want to just pay what we have been doing. Because what I've realized is that by the time a loan matures, we get another one to sort of repay that one and get more time. So at the end of the day, we are found in a cycle. So if we can leverage on each other's advantage and present to the world a unified market, and then leverage on our endowment, I've talked about agriculture, I've talked about green technology. Basically, what do we have that we can leverage on so that we produce more on that and we avoid importing what we can sort of produce, and we avoid exporting raw materials. And all this will boil down to the governance within our continent. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Diana. Very well put on the governance matters and the political will that is required for that unified stance that African countries can present. So let me hand over to the next hand that is raised by Michael Asiedu. Michael, I'll allow you to talk and you can share your question with the speakers.
Thank you for the opportunity. Having listened to the earlier speaker on the issue of trade imbalances, my observation is looking around Africa, out of the 54 sovereign nations, I ask myself, which of these countries has a sustainable energy production in terms of reliable energy sources? And to the best of my knowledge, none out of the 54. Even Nigeria being a net exporter of crude oil, talk about South Africa with all the infrastructure and everything has energy or electricity deficiency. So of course, to be able to add value to the supply chain, you need reliable and an affordable energy ecosystem. And look, if you come to the US, of all nations, that's as projecting sustainable and clean energy. Nearly 10% of their energy supply comes from coal. You cannot even talk about gas and other things. So for Africa to make progress, make impact, we need sustainable, we need reliable energy sources. And over the years, most countries have depended on hydroelectricity. And that is no longer sustainable due to climate change, because for hydro, you depend on water, mostly natural rainfall. And that has not, over the year, supported our growth agenda. So, I mean, probably we should look at investment in nuclear energy, which is more reliable and probably even safer compared to other sources. Because without sustainable and reliable energy sources, you cannot get into industrialization, manufacturing, you can't add value. And even if you can, you cannot depend on plants, which is very expensive, and you are no longer competitive on the international stage. So for distinguished researchers like you at the Boston University, I believe that you can make a strong case for African countries probably to move away from their over-reliance on hydro sources to venture into more sustainable sources like nuclear energy. Solar is great, but the technology is still low, and the contribution even to the US market is still low. Because if you look at
thank you, Michael. I have to cut you. I'm so sorry. I think the speakers have captured the essence of what you are trying to encourage. Thank you so much for your question. Very valid question on sustainable systems. I think to that, there also needs to be sustainable infrastructure in order to, maintain the projects that African countries are, developing for employment, for skills development, economic growth. So what are your responses to that question by Michael? We don't have to speak too much on, the energy options between nuclear and renewable, but mainly on his question around the sustainable systems that are required.
Yes, well, first on the issue of nuclear power, I know we didn't want to go too much into depth on that, and there isn't really that much to say. I know that China has tried to promote one project in Sudan, a nuclear energy project that fell through. So I don't see, in partnership with the Chinese, the avenue of nuclear energy bearing fruit in Africa. I don't think that China is going to be much of a partner in that. When it comes to hydropower, I take what you say, Michael. I think there still is a lot of untapped potential there, however. Currently, Africa is only using 11% of its hydropower potential, and that's compared to 53% in the EU. I think there's a lot more to be done there. I think there the bottleneck is going to be whether or not China is still willing to fund big ticket items. Of course, hydropower plants are extremely expensive. They are gigantic projects, and whether China in the future, with its kind of downscaling of lending, is going to support these types of big ticket items, I don't know. And of course, the other bottleneck is, although this is a renewable energy source, a clean energy source, there are other environmental things to consider there. There's, of course, population displacement, changing of entire ecosystems. So these are projects that take a long time, they take a lot of negotiations with communities, and like I said, it's unclear whether China is going to want to finance big ticket items like that in the future. I do think that there's potential on the Chinese side to do more in solar because they have these green technologies. They're the biggest producer of panels. Curiously, we haven't seen those panels exported much to Africa, and we've seen very few projects there. So that's really something personally that I'm pinning my hope on, would be to see more solar. There's the capacity on the Chinese side, and there's the demand and the potential there on the African side, and I think this is a great match. And the financing bottlenecks need to be closed. That's what I would have to say about that.
Thank you so much for that, Lucas. So in the interest of time, I think we're just going to take one more question, which will help us wrap up the webinar, but we will try our best to send over the remaining questions. They're quite a lot. We'll send them to our speakers and have them respond within the report that will be produced regarding this webinar. So the question is on the FOCAC, and what are your expectations during the September FOCAC in terms of China's development finance pledges to African countries? Apart from monetary promises, what else do you expect to come out of the summit? And I just want to add to that question, then, if we look at it within the African perspective, what is it that you think Africa should go into those discussions, and what position should they go into those discussions having for the betterment of Africa's development? I'll hand over both to you, Lucas and Diana. Thank you.
What do we expect or what should we go with to this particular conference?
Yes, so it's what are your expectations in terms of China's development finance pledges to African countries? Apart from the monetary promises, what else do you expect will come out of the summit? Then the second part of that is, what is it that Africa should go into those discussions having? What position should Africa go into those discussions having?
I suppose we should go into these discussions with a clear mind of basically what we want, and with a unified, I would say, with a unified voice, so that we are not disaggregated in a way that if, for instance, we are talking about investment and the conditions, the policies that are attached to them, we are very clear that this is what we want, and as much as we would want the investments to come to our continent, then would want them I believe there's quite a number of policies, or what do I call them? Some things that are attached to anything that is given. So they should be very clear on what is being attached and what should be the gain to us, so that we don't have much drain. As I've seen, quite a number of questions have been focused. What is there for Africa, especially now when we are talking about high unemployment rate? We should be very clear even on what is ailing Africa as we move there, so that we are not looking at, for example, the debt distress we are in, but we are looking at what gain or what revenue will come forth when we get this investment, so that we can be able to repay. I'm also looking at them talking about the green energy and funding, sustainable and productive investments within Africa. So basically, we should be on this table with which kind of investments would we want them to venture in when it comes to our continent, and what can we export and what can we import, because we know ourselves better. We know what is our comparative advantage, and that way we can be able even to know what we can export and what we can import. I think that's what I would say, especially on the second part of the question. I think I've lost the first part. Sorry about that.
Thank you for that, Diana. I think I'll add to that. What can we export and what can we import in our terms? Lucas, over to you.
Yeah, I can't agree more with Diana. I think it's incredibly important that African countries go in as a unified voice. In FOCAC, of course, it's very convenient for China to have this as a kind of a bilateral relationship between China and the countries of Africa individually, because of course China outweighs any of those countries in economic might. That's very convenient for China to go in from a very powerful negotiating position. However, if it has to face a unified African bloc, the countries of Africa will have much more of a voice, much more of a strong negotiating position. I can't emphasize that enough, that a unified voice really is the strategy to go in with. In terms of what we can expect in terms of outcomes, I myself am not clear on this. What I'm going to have my eye on personally is whether we see these big infrastructure and finance pledges. We haven't seen them in recent years. In 2018, we saw a kind of emphasis on high quality China-Africa engagement. This came as a kind of a blowback to China's neglect of ESG standards in favor of rapid deployment of these projects. So that's what we saw. We also saw during the pandemic FOCAC a kind of a relief approach without big infrastructure pledges. I think we're seeing a gradual normalization of China-Africa economic relations now post-pandemic, with some increased pledges in terms of finance. But whether this next FOCAC is going to be a return to the early Belt and Road years, where there's multi-billion-dollar pledges for various sectors and different projects, I doubt it. But I'd be interested to see what those pledges look like, how specific they are. And I think that will tell us a lot about whether China intends to return to their approach to financing big ticket items or not. But certainly what I would expect is a focus on high quality engagement. This has very much come out of the early BRI years, when it was important to get these projects out there, but ESG really didn't matter. And China has come to the realization that that's not a sustainable strategy, and I expect to see that in the next FOCAC, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Lucas, and thank you, Diana, for your time and for unpacking and breaking down all the bits to that report to our attendees. I am sure that this has been very beneficial to present some context, some understanding to what is being assessed from 2000 to 2022, which is quite a huge data set and retelling of the patterns that have been seen there, and also forecasting on what is to come within China's engagements in Africa. So we truly appreciate the time that you have given in going in depth into that report. And the report will be published again on our website within the report of this webinar. We will share this recording as well as along with the other resources that were presented during the discussion. So I think with that, we can close this webinar. I'm sure I don't speak for myself when I say it was truly very engaging, insightful, informative, and helpful within our attendees from their various regions and professions. I'm sure there's a lot that each and everyone can take from this engagement, and we appreciate attendees as well as speakers for making this possible. So before we close, we would also like to share some opportunities that the Africa-China Reporting Project has recently published within our website. So if you go onto our opportunities page, you will see that we have recently launched a call for applications for reporting grants. And this is for journalists, media scholars, and professionals who are working on climate change in Africa and would like to submit a reporting grant that is not exceeding the budget of 1,500 USD. And that deadline is on the 13th of August. So please visit our website to read more about that opportunity and how you can apply. And then the second opportunity that we are excited to share is the launch of our MOOC that we are presenting in collaboration with Dialogue Earth. And this offers a 6-part course. It's a free course for professionals, media professionals in Africa who want to develop their journalism career and build their capacity on reporting on climate in the continent. That MOOC is available on Dialogue Earth's website as well as on the Africa-China Reporting Project website. So please look out for those opportunities and many more which will be coming on our website under our opportunities tab. And if there's any other questions or comments or information or assistance that you would like to receive, whether from the Africa-China Reporting Project or by the Global Development Policy Center or the African Economic Research Consortium, please feel free to email either all of us or each of us in our respective addresses, and we'll be more than happy to assist you within your ongoing investigations or research or within your whatever profession that is related to China's engagement in Africa. So we'll leave opportunities running on screen and then we will close the webinar just in case you would like to read more onto what is presented. Thank you so much. Thank you once again to our speakers, Lucas, Diana, Maureen, as well as Charles. Thank you for your time and thank you for the contribution that you continue making. We really are appreciative. Thank you, attendees, for your time as well, and we look forward to engaging with you further.